To the 2010 Tabula Poetica Poetry Reading Series. We are happy to have you all here today, and we hope that you'll return for our other poetry events this fall. Lynn Thompson will be at Chapman University on October 12th. Allison Joseph will be here on November 9th. And we wrap up the series with a reading by our own MFA students on November 30th. Those are all Tuesdays. You can find more details on our website, and you can find that through the Chapman website, or you can join our Facebook group. It's called Tabula Poetica. Please take a moment to make sure your cell phones are turned off or silenced. Also, if you didn't notice it on your way in, Barnes & Noble has books by all this year's Tabula Poetica visiting poets available for purchase. They'll be at the reading also. And we'll have time for book signing at the end of this and then at the end of the reading. I want to thank the English department for tremendous support of Tabula Poetica and poets and writers for grants to support each writer's visit. Professor Logan Esdale, right up here in front, has been part of Tabula Poetica from its inception, and I especially appreciate his contributions to the project's ongoing success. In fact, let's give him a round of applause. Also, Tabula Poetica's graduate assistant, Natalie Dave, is right there in the middle. And the English department's admin, Jennifer Klunk, they both worked very hard to make this year's series happen. Let's give them a round of applause, too. This afternoon, we have a special guest to introduce Patty Seyburn. Charlene Baldwin is the Dean of Leatherby Libraries. She has created a welcoming space there for students, faculty, and staff to find information and ideas, even when they don't know exactly what they're looking for. Dean Baldwin has been a supporter of Tabula Poetica since it began by providing great venues for our readings and by providing refreshments whenever our students read their work in the library. She also participated in our Chapman Reads Poetry video series, so if you haven't seen that, go to our website. It's a series of short videos in which Chapman community members read their favorite poems. She's a Peace Corps alum, and I'll add that I think she's made some excellent hiring decisions in the library. Please help me welcome Charlene Baldwin.
You probably all know that what Anna meant by that is her husband, Dr. Doug Deco, is one of our librarians in the library. And we'd like to say that we think that Chapman made a huge, huge gain by hiring both of them to come here and join us on this campus. I'm really honored to be able to make this introduction today. Can you all hear me? Does this work? Okay. I'm an English major. Yay! And so that makes me especially proud to be able to introduce our poet today and also to make it possible to host the Tabula Poetica readings in the library each fall. So thank you very much. I went on to become a librarian after being an English major, but we all find our separate paths, don't we? So it's my pleasure today to introduce our poet, Dr. Patty Seyburn. She grew up in Detroit. She has a BS and an MS in journalism from Northwestern University and an MFA in poetry from the University of California, Irvine. She also earned her PhD in poetry and literature from the University of Houston. And she's currently an assistant professor at Cal State University, Long Beach, and co-editor of Pool, a journal of poetry, which I have never looked into, so I must do that. She is the author of 3 published works, and a number of journals have published her poetry. And you all have read these, I guess, as part of your classes in anticipation of Dr. Seyburn's visit. We have all 3 of them in the library. 2 of them are now currently signed. And I had a lot of fun reading through them over the last few days. I love your work. I'm looking forward to hearing the reading tonight. She has won several prizes for poetry. She won the Mechanical Cluster and Diasporatic, one of these books here, won the 1997 Marianne Moore Poetry Prize and the American Library Association's Notable Book Award for 2000. And I just learned from her that she now has won the 2010 Pushcart Prize, which is a very exclusive group of poets who are selected by that journal to be published in their anthology. So we will then have that in the library as well. So we're very pleased about that. She also has had her poetry reviewed. It's always nice when you get reviews. And I loved this review in New Issues Poetry and Prose by Steve Langan. And he made some really interesting comparisons or discussion of her poetry. I love some of the words. Writing poetry of idiosyncratic patterns through which, I can't even say it. Patty Seyburn writes a poetry of idiosyncratic patterns through which she restlessly questions and names. He goes on and talks about rhythmic language helping to create surprise and mystery. And he mentions a lot of his favorite poems, and one of mine from her work I love, of course, you can imagine why I was drawn immediately to this poem, called First Bookshelf. And I was looking for library in it, but it wasn't that. It's really more of like a magical fable kind of thing that talks about characters. And I'm sure you'll get into some of the allegories and the deepness of your poetry when you talk to us now and when you read tonight. So it is just an incredible pleasure for me to bring to the podium this afternoon our visiting poet, Dr. Patty Seyburn. Patty.
No, I just need a little AV help. I'm just slightly AV challenged. Fabulous, thank you. Humans are attracted to danger, and in particular to watching others endanger themselves. This explains the success of Evel Knievel and of circus acts. The high wire, the sword swallower, the flying trapeze, teams of men who ride motorcycles inside of circular metal cages, the handsome horseback riders, and Siegfried and Roy. This talk is the academic equivalent of the circus, as I'm speaking about the relationship of humor and poetry. Why to be funny in a poem, when to be funny in a poem, how to be funny in a poem. Different reactions to humor. The belly laugh, the chuckle, the snicker, the nod, the wry smile, the quiet acknowledgement. These are all different forms of approbation. The risk of talking about being funny in relation to poetry and otherwise is, of course, the expectation that you will be funny. I was talking to my graduate students about this yesterday, my anxiety about that. Therefore, the risk of not being funny. But I want to assure you that that's not my primary concern here. What I would like to do for my sake and yours is to figure out why a poet would take such a risk. Isn't poetry risky enough? Little social or financial approbation. Generally, one is discouraged by parents, one's work ignored by loved ones, friends, acquaintances, and sometimes treated in an insultingly dismissive fashion. You're a good writer, people have told me over the last 2 decades. Why not write a screenplay? The greatest risk in poetry should be that of emotional vulnerability or intellectual exploration, a revelation of how one truly thinks or feels, the possibility of catharsis, of truly being changed, as Rilke exhorts us in his famous poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo. He writes, "You must change your life." Can a funny poem change your life? Pound said, "Go in fear of abstractions." Keats wrote, "Poetry should come as naturally as leaves from a tree or should not come at all." No one ever said to a poet, "Be funny, goddammit. Be really, really funny." And yet humor is something I value using in my own work and reading in others' poems. In exploring the elements of humor in poetry, I'd like to offer some parameters, some premises, and some poems. First, the parameters. One is, I am not talking about light verse. I could not write Jabberwocky, though as I think about it, such an assignment is along the lines of how I like to torture my graduate students, so they may have to. 2, I am not advocating using humor in poetry over not, nor do I espouse that this is the gospel of humor in poetry. I am one poet who, for reasons not altogether foreign to me, seems to be known as someone capable of incorporating humor in my work. I'm not a funny poet all the time, and as I reviewed my books in preparation for today, I was actually struck by how unfunny and even dour much of my work is. Nonetheless, I seem to have earned this reputation. 3, let's acknowledge that humor in poetry is used to greater and lesser degrees and seeks an equally great variety of reactions. Sometimes a poem is trying to get a laugh. Why? The situation is funny, ironic, ridiculous, and the poet wants to convey that. More often, a poet employs some element of humor to temper the gravity of a situation or to point out an ironic aspect of a moment or scene. As often, a poet uses language that itself is funny, as in language that contains funny sounds, such as diphthong, indubitably, tuchus, carbuncle, rumpus, cahoots. I don't know what makes these words funny, but try saying them in a conversation, and someone will probably laugh just a little bit. But let me reiterate here, there are many types of reactions to humor, and if amused silence is yours, feel free to own that. Not every poem that incorporates humor desires an overt reaction from the audience. Despite the growth of the stand-up poetry community, poetry and stand-up are entirely different animals. Poets generally understand that laughter is a social reaction, and that each person in a crowd, each component, contributes to whether an individual or group will react robustly, nervously, or not at all. So here are some premises and some poems to go along with them. 1, many funny poems start out funny and become unfunny, or as we say in common parlance, serious or deep. They use humor to woo you, the reader, to lure you into their lair, and then when you are comfortable, even confident that things will not get too introspective or profound, they turn on you and become about something other than the humor or the irony or anger. In other words, funny poems begin like really great first dates, and somewhere, usually around 2/3 of the way through, you end up with a ring on your finger. Here are 2 examples by Tony Hoagland, both from his book, What Narcissism Needs to Me, and actually I'm going to read one example from him. I think I'll read these 2. This is called Commercial for a Summer Night. That one night in the middle of the summer, when people move their chairs outside and put their TVs on the porch so the dark is full of murmuring blue lights. We were drinking beer with the sound off, watching the figures on the screen, the bony blondes, the lean-jawed guys who decorate the perfume and the cars, the pretty ones the merchandise is wearing this year. Alex said, I wish they made a shooting gallery using people like that. Greg said, that woman has a PhD in face. That's not a good line. Then we saw a preview for a movie about a movie star who is having a movie made about her, and Boz said, this country is getting stupider every year. Then Greg said that things were better in the 60s, and Russ said that Harold Bloom said that Nietzsche said nostalgia is the blank check issued to a weak mind, and Greg said they didn't have checks back then, stupid, and Susan said, it's too bad you guys can't get spell check for your brains. Then Greg left, and Margaret arrived, and a breeze carried honeysuckle fumes across the yard, and Alex finished his quart of beer, and Boz leaned back in his chair, and the beautiful people on the TV screen moved back and back, looking very much now like shooting gallery ducks. And we sat in quiet pleasure on the shore of night, as a tide came in and turned and carried us, folding chairs and all, far out from the coastline of America, in a perfect commercial for our lives. And one more poem by Tony Hoagland called Phone Call. Maybe I overdid it when I called my father an enemy of humanity. That might have been a little strongly put, a slight over-exaggeration, an immoderate description of the person who, at that moment 2,000 miles away, holding the telephone receiver 6 inches from his ear, must have regretted paying for my therapy. What I meant was that my father was an enemy of my humanity, and what I meant behind that was that my father was split into 2 people, one of whom living deep inside of me like a bad king or an incurable disease, blighting my crops, striking down my herds, poisoning my wells. the other standing in another time zone in a kitchen in Wyoming with bad knees and white hair sprouting from his ears. I don't want to scream forever. I don't want to live without proportion, like some kind of infection from the past. So I have to remember the second father, the one whose TV dinner is getting cold when he holds the phone in his left hand and stares blankly out the window, where just now the sun is going down and the last fingertips of sunlight are withdrawing from the hills they once touched like a child. In Commercial for a Summer Night, the poem begins with some good banter among friends who are smart and smart-assed. When the talking is done, however, the poem behind the poem begins, and the people who actually populate the poem find themselves content with their lots, their critiques, their lives. In Phone Call, after being continuously funny for 21 lines, the narrator starts to feel sympathy for the father, starts to realize that he too has to process his hostility and move on. So much for funny. Funny was a vehicle. Funny lured the reader to contentment, self-realization, and even compassion. You could say funny was a trick. Premise 2. There are aspects of humor in poetry that can and cannot be taught, such as A, timing. I'm confident that musicians, and I'm sure there's some in this room, have the last word on this. But I will swear that I have managed to help students improve their knowledge and use of meter and rhythm in poetry. Rhythm is only one aspect of timing, however. Timing is usually the beat or the pause after what has been said or the unsaid. It is the white space. I have seen many poets pump a great deal of white space into their poems, but when they read them aloud, you never know it was there. And in service of this, I need to tell a joke, and I need, Anna, would you help me? So I want you to ask me, what is the most important thing about telling a joke?
What is the most
Timing. All right. You see my point. All right. Thank you. Thank you. The second thing that I don't think can be taught is what I'm going to call the lens. And this is how you see the world. How to see the world in an ironic fashion, the need to defend yourself with humor. If the world does not seem to you a place worthy of mocking, be it in hope of amelioration or destruction, which is usually ultimately in search of amelioration, I don't think that can be taught. If you are a person who usually says in response to something funny, you know, that's very funny. In lieu of a physical reaction, you may wish to content yourself with serious poetry. 3, self-doubt. In my experience, poets own a combination of undeserved overconfidence and equally undeserved insecurity. I do think that to incorporate humor in one's poetry, a hearty dose of self-doubt must be part of your personality. There are those who don't have this often mistake cleverness for humor. Cleverness is the annoying jab of the ribs that does nothing to further the poem, though its veneer may be witty and even intelligent. It's often a function of wanting to be funny in a poem too desperately, of trying too hard. Unfortunately, we know that trying too hard in many aspects of life backfires. But I would like to quote Albert Brooks in the movie Broadcast News when he says, "Wouldn't this be a great world if insecurity and desperation made us more attractive? If needy were a turn-on?" In relation to this issue, a degree of desperation and neediness is not only attractive, but necessary. Delivery. It struck me as I was preparing this talk and reading poems aloud how important the ability to not necessarily perform, but to read the poem aloud is. I first heard Richard Howard, one of the best readers alive, read Our Spring Trip, his poem, in Houston, and I'm going to read that for you, shortly after he wrote it. His ability to recapture the voice of the Midwestern 10-year-old, some part of whom still lived within Richard, certainly heightened the comic effect and thus the pathos of the poem, which leads me to another premise. Delivery plays a more important role in poetry that incorporates humor than in completely serious poetry due to its life off the page. By extension, poets who use humor are aware of and even desiring of an audience. As poets, we often declare our fealty to our work in isolation rather than to the reader or listener. In the case of this subject, truly the audience is what matters. The audience alone can decide if humor earns its keep in a poem and if the effects it produces are desirable, ancillary, damaging, or hazardous to the greater product of poetry. Some of you might say that the word greater is part of the problem, that poetry takes itself too seriously, that profundity outweighs all other concerns, including enjoyment. We'll see. I'd like to read you Our Spring Trip by Richard Howard. And unfortunately, I don't have this to show you. Our Spring Trip. Dear Mrs. Masters, hi from the 5th grade class of Park School. We're still here in New York City at the Taft Hotel. You could have guessed that from the picture printed on the stationery. I inked in X's to show you our rooms, which are actually on the same floor as the Terminal Tower observation deck in Cleveland, Ohio, which we visited on our 4th grade spring trip, but nowhere near so high as some skyscrapers in New York City. We've been up to the top of the Empire State and the Chrysler buildings, which are really tall. But there's another reason for writing besides wanting to say hi. We're having a problem Miss Husband thought you might help us with once we get back to school. Yesterday we went to the Dinosaur Hall of the Natural History Museum for our class project. As you know, the 5th grade is constructing this life-size Diplodocus out of chicken wire and some stuff Miss Husband calls paper mache. But no diagram we have shows how the tail balances the head to keep our big guy upright. We need to see how the backbone of a real Diplodocus manages to bear so much weight. Did you know that some dinosaurs, like the Brontosaurus, are so huge they have a whole other brain at the base of their spine just to move their tail? Another thing, each time Arthur Englander came anywhere near a Diplodocus, it would collapse because of not balancing right. This went on until David Stashower got so mad at Arthur that he flew at him and gave his left shoulder a really good bite so he would keep away. That was when you called the all-school assembly to explain about the biting. Biting's no good. Even so, Arthur decided not to come on this year's spring trip. Well, we took a subway train to the museum from the Taft Hotel. In fact, that was our very first excursion, but the noise once we were on the platform was so loud one girl, Nancy Akers, cried. She was always chicken. When someone told her that terrible roaring the expresses made was Tyrannosaurus Rex himself, and she believed it. Then we went to the Great Hall where we were surrounded by dinosaurs, all the kinds we had studied. Some were not much bigger than a chicken, but some were humongous. One was just a skeleton wired together, so it was easy to see how we could make our Diplodocus balance by putting a swivel in its neck. All the other dinosaurs were stuffed, I guess, with motors and lights inside. When they moved, their heads balanced their tails. There was even a pterodactyl flying back and forth above our heads, probably on some kind of track. But even though Miss Husband tried explaining for the 100th time how the dinosaurs had all been extinct for millions of years, not one person in the class believed what she said. The idea of a million years is so stupid. Anyway, a typical grown-up reason. You know the Klein twins, the biggest brains in the whole 5th grade? A lot bigger, probably, than both brains combined in that Brontosaurus. Well, they had a question for Miss Husband. What if the dinosaurs being extinct so long was just a smokescreen for being somewhere else, a long ways away? And Lucy Wensley made an awful pun on stinky and extinct. Actually, Mrs. Masters, we've already figured it out about death. The dinosaurs may be extinct, but they're not dead. It's a different thing, you know? When Duncan Chu's Lhasa jumped out the window, or when Miss Husband's parents were killed together in a car crash, we understood that. That was being dead, gone, no body around. Isn't that what dying has to mean, not being here? The dinosaurs are with us all the time, anything but dead. We keep having them. Later at the Dinosaurus, the museum restaurant, there was chicken breast for lunch stamped out in the shape of a triceratops. Strange how everything has to taste like chicken. Whether it's rabbit or rattlesnake, it's always just like chicken. Anyway, dinosaurs are alive as long as we think they are. Not like Duncan's dog. And that's just the problem. By next week, though, we'll be back in Sandusky. And while we're putting the swivel into our Diplodocus neck, you could explain to us about time, about those millions of years, and dinosaur chicken in the diner, and chick-sized dinosaurs in the Great Hall, and where they really are. I wish I'd written that. I didn't. I wish I had. At this point, I'm going to do a real strange veer over to Aristotle, who did not have much to say about humor and poetry, but offered some pithy words about making an argument, which Richard Howard's poem does. So let's review his famous appeals. There's ethos, credibility, or the ethical appeal, which refers to the trustworthiness or credibility of the writer or speaker. There's pathos, the emotional appeal, which is actually Greek for suffering or experience, which is often associated with an emotional appeal. But a better equivalent might be an appeal to the audience's sympathies or imagination. And then there's logos, the logical appeal, which means persuading by use of deductive and inductive reasoning to back up one's claims, and includes the clarity of the claim, the logic of the reasons, and the effectiveness of the supporting evidence. I find that Our Spring Trip employs all of these appeals. Howard works hard to convince us of the authenticity of the speaker, using the smart child's diction, history, and earnest tonality. He manages to make us feel connected with the narrator as we rejoin him in childhood, where profound questions are often asked, quite accidentally. Finally, he walks us through his narrator's logical reasoning as he proves his premise about none other than time. Where I believe Howard is especially successful is that while this poem is funny, perhaps a more accurate word is charming, it does not mock its narrator's earnestness. In an article on the Academy of American Poets website, Matthew Rohrer, who is a youngish, funny poet, quite earnestly defends irony and satire, contrasting their employment with serious, earnest poems. It's a funny essay. Every time I read his third paragraph, which begins, Carolyn Forche, someone who has never been accused of being a funny poet, I snicker, because she's really not funny at all. When I read his critique of Jory Graham, and I quote, another writer who is supposed to be taken seriously because she writes almost exclusively in the voice of the classics or great philosophers, I snicker again. Where I differ from Rohrer, and I would be happy to talk about this over beers with him, is where he says that oppression needs to be earnest in order to be feared by those it needs to cow. He writes, irony and satire are the tools by which the oppressed get to make fun of the oppressors without the oppressors getting it. I have trouble thinking of any poets as the oppressors, and any readers in the free world beyond those forced to read the Twilight series in their book clubs, as the oppressed. I think when we are mocking anyone in a poem, it is best to mock ourselves, and that is when a reader or listener feels free to laugh, confident that the joke is not being turned on him or her. 3. There would seem to be a relationship, though not an exclusive one, between humor and poetry in strict form. To back up this assertion, I'll turn briefly to Dorothy Parker and to Philip Larkin. I'm sure you're probably familiar with these poems, and they are quite brief. The first one is called Resume by Dorothy Parker. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Cheery way to start the day. And here's Mr. Larkin. This is called This Be the Verse. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. I know, aren't you happier that you were here? See, now I think these poems are funny. Not yuck-fest funny, and they come from a school of thought that differentiates, as you might imagine, dark laughter theories from genial laughter theories. I've done some research into this. Needless to say, these are from the dark laughter theory school, which is to say, laughter that arises from some form of hostility, aggression, or other unpleasant impulses. As you heard in that lovely introduction, I'm a poet and an academic, and the poet side of me wants to just read you poems, of course. The academic side of me wants to cite studies, people who are smarter than I am, who've researched what humor is and why it works. And so I want to mention a couple of these, and I think you'll see why. There's an article by two professors at the University of Manitoba in the Department of Psychiatry, and this is what they write about humor. Humor is a complex cognitive function which often leads to laughter. Contemporary humor theorists have begun to formulate hypotheses outlining the possible innate cognitive structures underlying humor. Humor's conspicuous presence in the behavioral repertoire of humankind invites adaptive explanations. The authors conclude that several evolutionary-related topics, such as the origins of language, cognition, underlying spiritual feelings, hominid group size, and primate teasing, could have special relevance to the origins of humor. And here, this article contained a few statements that I found particularly resonant, and these are exact quotes. Humor has certainly been around for thousands of years, and possibly even a few million years. I know. If I read that one of my students' essays, I can't imagine what I would do. I like this. Laughter is a seizure-like activity that can be elicited by experiencing a humorous cognitive stimulus. Known as the laughing philosopher, Democritus not only had a reputation for his mirthful disposition, but perhaps also for his tendency to, quote, laugh at the stupidity of his fellow citizens. This article asks, how does humor specifically enhance fitness? Van Hoof, 1972, proposes that possible phylogenetic roots of smiling could reside in the bared teeth display seen in many mammals, while laughter could be related to the relaxed open-mouth display often observed in primates and often associated with playful activities. One more article and then a couple of poems. This article called Tracing the Origin of Humor, the author Daniel Perlmutter writes, where does humor come from? And what is it finally that makes us laugh? And when he talks about humor, he quotes Thomas Hobbes and Arthur Koestler and Jacques Lacan and, of course, Freud. And he writes, the earliest attempts at a theory sought to establish primary categories and characteristics, and these are important, such as surprise, contradiction, incongruity, inconsistency, or disparagement. Then also they added a few more themes, and these are important. Superiority, aggression, stupidity, disparagement, sex, and ethnic put-downs. To this, Raskin, 1985, adds hostility, malice, and derision. So I decided to sort of test out all these categories and to look through as much poetry and see what I could find. So I went to the humor edition of Poetry Magazine from July, August 2006. And I wanted to just read you a couple of the beginnings of poems, and we can see together how they fit into the categories that this scholar defines. This is a poem called Irish Poetry, and it's by Billy Collins. He writes, that morning under a pale hood of sky, I heard the unambiguous scrape of spackling against the side of our wickered penitential house. So Irish poetry, this falls under ethnic put-downs. Okay, so far so good. All right, by Dean Young, this poem is called Sean Penn Anti-Ode. Must Sean Penn always look like he's squeezing the last drops out of a sponge and the sponge is his face? That's derision. And here's also, I can't not do this, although, this is also a poem by Dean Young called Poem on a Theme by Tony Hoagland, and they are very good friends. And here's the first two lines. I have a big erection, most of mythology goes into it. Sex, that was the sex. There's more sex, I'll skip over those. All right, here's a poem titled Humanity at Guantanamo. And that fits in without reading any more on the incongruence category. All right. This is a category I invented, I'm proud to say, and it's you'll see what it is, I think. It's a poem called All Me by Mark Halliday. I'll just read the first bit. One night when the lawn was a sequined black chemise and the piebald moonlit trees clicked like cool marbles in the decorous air, and the whole condominium complex buzzed with the rumor of my latest award, I lay in the grass feeling the enormity of pretty much everything. And I think call this the mockery of poetry, pretension, self category. Right. There is one more category, which I also came up with, which is simply called, and maybe you'll figure out what it is. It's a poem called "Screaming My Heads Off," and here it is. Let's see. Norbert Hirschhorn. Thousands of Norberts, hundreds of Hirschhorns, but only one Norbert Hirschhorn. And if I ever meet another Norbert Hirschhorn, I will kick him in the tuchus. And this category is Yiddish words. Yiddish words. All Yiddish words are funny. So I invented two categories, in other words. So I'm sure the scholars will be calling me anytime. In other words, the sociologist, the anthropologist, and the psychiatrist are right. What they don't account for, the X factor, is taste, or my mother used to say, there's no accounting for taste. One man's beauty is another man's dog. What I find funny, you may find inappropriate, silly, crass, dull, or simply incomprehensible. What makes being funny in a poem is even more of a risk. But what is life without risk? As poet George Herbert said, you must lose a fly to catch a trout. Such is the writing of poetry. I'd like to conclude by, let me just review something quickly. There's one more study by a philosopher named Henri Bergson called Laughing, an Essay on the Meaning of the Comic, and he makes three main assertions. One, the comic does not exist outside the pale of what is strictly human. A landscape may be beautiful, charming, or sublime. It will never be laughable. You may laugh at an animal, but only because you have detected in it some human attitude or expression. Two, here I would point out a symptom equally worthy of notice, the absence of feeling, which usually accompanies laughter. And he talks about the momentary anesthesia of the heart and says that the appeal of laughter is to intelligence pure and simple. Three, you would hardly appreciate the comic if you felt yourself isolated from others. Laughter appears to stand in need of an echo. Our laughter is always the laughter of a group. However spontaneous it seems, laughter always implies a kind of secret Freemasonry or even complicity with other laughers, real or imaginary. I agree and disagree with Bergson. I agree that the comedic in poetry or otherwise draws on what is most human about us. I agree that humor is not always kind or pretty. And though I love the phrase a momentary amnesia of the heart and plan to steal it for a poem, I do not find the appeal of the comic purely intellectual. I believe it involves feeling. Finally, I agree with Bergson about laughter and its complicity, how it connects an individual with others, be they real or imaginary. In closing, I'd like to read you the final poem of my third collection, and the collection's called Hilarity. And the poem is called The Emergence of Hilarity. And it may be a little funny in parts, but maybe more importantly, it's really about humor. The Emergence of Hilarity, Chapter 1. Once upon a time, when time was a series of scratched lines and gouged holes in sticks and bones, designed to evaluate the moon's phases, before time became an obelisk, a sundial, an hourglass, a pendulum, when the earth was innumerable and immeasurable, no one laughed. There was little to laugh about. Preyed upon and preying upon the slower, the dumber, and the overwhelming sense of no control while the elements flailed in the chaos. This was not a world deserving of nostalgia like pre-war anywhere with its cafes of curved metal chairs that made anyone look more nuanced than average. This world was serious, its gravity psychic and physical. Chapter 2. until one day one man named for the more tedious and remarkable stage of development, give or take a few hundred centuries, when he'd managed to kill a horned, furred deer and foolishly ran back to his shelter to tell the missus, and then could not find his way back to said deer, not a deer at all, the progenitor of some more feral creature that did not survive evolutionary peril, the entire population vanquished by one bad winter when a winter lasted the duration of a generation, chose to find the situation, if you can believe it, amusing rather than dire. For now, in lieu of the promised bounty, all he could offer was a befuddled apology, and that night and several after, he would get only a stinky skin to warm his filthy feet. For some reason, he found this funny. This was an exceptional guy who centuries before would have stomped around the plains until he died of thirst or was killed by the family of the very animal he slaughtered in a simplistic ambush. Chapter 3. Not our hero. He found himself trying to explain while his mate, no wilting flower, began to wonder how he would taste, boiled with indigent herbs and roots. He gestured toward the entry of their dwelling as if to say, hey, it's a big world out there, and I swear I made the kill. You should have seen it, honey. We could have fed an army, except that they were loners, tribeless nomads who did not yet fathom the benefits of groups. As the tale grew, so did his gestures. The performance became acrobatic, and when he reached the part about the creature, which would be tougher than a cross between oysters and jerky, it happened. A staccato jolt, a guttural flutter traveled from stomach to throat to mouth, reverberating in his fingers and once in the air, bounced off the walls haphazardly, either echoing or dully absorbed by their cave or hut, hut or cave. Chapter 4. He heard it, she heard it. He could not stop, for it felt good, which he could only later describe as a feeling absent hunger, exhaustion, and fear. At some point, his mate, certain that whatever controlled avalanches and winged furies, had captured whatever within him made his open his eyes and rise with the light. And the only solution was to beat it out. And so she did, with that large stick that leaned against their entranceway, where one day an umbrella with a curved handle would lounge. She aimed at his feet and hands, as they knew that ports of entry for what could only be called evil would be the extremities. Seeing this did no good except to make our hero dance to avoid her thrusts, she landed one squarely on his head and he slumped to the ground. This would be the end of the story, Chapter 5, if irony were all, and the emergence of hilarity would be delayed until another age, and more generations of humorless Homo erectus would wander the earth with little comfort, only occasionally wondering, is that all there is? Instead, our happy hunter recovered and succeeded in convincing his soulmate that his reaction was worthy of praise and repetition, since events such as the disappearing deer occurred often, and the usual vituperative fish-shaking did not, as he noted, bring back the deer. He would return many times to the clearing, he believed the source of his mirth. He had taken the wrong turn at the forked tree, and established an altar there, of sorts, where he tested another practice, Chapter 6, and began to think, to speak, to praise, whatever gave him the impulse to look beyond his loss and brought him back from the hard blows lovingly dealt. And the divine comedian who fashioned man-woman deer shelter out of a substance akin to vinegar dough recipe to follow agreed this was a fine gift and should not be delayed. The time was right. People needed something to mitigate innumerable hardships, ordeals, obstacles, bad trips. And so around 14 weeks, 7 days to creation, when sound is voice, is the absence of blood's loud tides, the child, prodded by the immeasurable, erupts, and the social smile begets a sort of music, eliding joy and pain. Chapter 7, eliding joy and pain, and it pleases all who hear. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of questions before we wrap it up. Are there a couple of questions? If you ask the question, we'll have to repeat it into the microphone for the video. Somebody has a question.
Yes, the question was, in the book, in my book Hilarity, in my book Hilarity, there are the poems are divided into several sections, and there are quotations used dividing the sections. It's a good question. Poets often use some sort of quotation to sort of introduce a group of poems. And the first one in the first section, the first collection, is from Groucho Marx. A child of 5 would understand this. Send someone to fetch a child of 5. So I don't, I was looking for, but the next section is Virginia Woolf, and from To the Lighthouse, and that is a much more serious and sort of nature-oriented quote. I choose the quotes hoping that the quotation will in some way encompass the theme of what's going on in that section, and also the tonality of what's going on in that section. I think in that the first quote sets up the reader to understand that, in a way, not to be afraid of the book, to sort of plunge in and to know that this book is sort of reaching out to you, to both you as an adult intellectually and also to the pleasures that it would afford a child. And there's, as I mentioned earlier today, there's also quite a few references, and they're very veiled, to generation, to having a child in this section of the book in particular. There's a couple of poems in that section that are for my daughter, or sort of concern this notion of what it is to have a child, what it is to procreate, and what it is to parent. Crazy thing to do. So I really feel that those quotations are meant to kind of set up the reader, to establish just a little bit of expectation, but also to pique interest. Say, oh, what's going on there? Yes. Mm-hmm. I had said that before, that the audience is very important to people who write humorous poems, and the question was, do I have an audience who I try out work on? I actually don't have much of an audience. I have a couple of friends who I still share my work with, but not as often as I'd like, just because the exigencies of our lives make it difficult to do that. And humor is a funny thing, that especially, in the case of that, it's hard to know. I don't want to rest too much on someone's approval, I feel like it has to be instinctive. If I think it's funny, then it's funny. I don't know, then it's funny to me. That's right. That's really. But I don't really try out my work on anybody. I've asked. I have an occasional writing group, and I value their opinions, but I don't often make the changes they suggest, which sounds terrible. I think I was in workshop for 15 years, and a really dutiful person about that. And I think what happened for me is that being in a poetry workshop, be it in the university or in the sort of public sphere, it taught me, I internalized a lot of voices. A lot of smart people gave me a lot of smart advice, and I like to think that what happened is that I put them in my brain, and now I hear them. Somebody who's always concerned about verbs, I always hear them, what about the verbs? What about the verbs? So, I'm carrying around a lot of, a lot of voices in my head still. But I don't try things out often. No, maybe I should. Maybe I'll get back to that place, but I don't right now. You know what? I get to at readings, which is wonderful. At a reading, you sometimes hear what's flying and what's not. But you don't even rest too much on that, because frankly, as I said in the speech, sometimes people laugh. Sometimes people will laugh at everything, and you're like, God, I didn't even think that was funny. Apparently it is, in that moment, in that context. And other times you look out and you see them wanting to laugh, but they can't. You can see the sort of tension in the body. It's like, well, she didn't laugh, I can't laugh. You know what I mean? So, and I get that too. So it's not my expectation, that to really see a visible reaction, to something humorous in a poem. But that said, I am very aware of the audience, I'm very aware. If I ever seen somebody tuning out, I focus my gaze at them. Come back to me, and they know. You'll know. So that's right. All right.
Last questions? Oh, well, are there others that have their hands up? I don't know.
All right, we'll have 2 questions.
All right. I wondered if you could say a few words about your creativity's place you get to for poetry? I mean, obviously, you're not just a poet, you're a very good writer. This lecture was very well written and put together, but
Thank
talk
you.
about the poetry. Where do you go, physically as well as mentally? How do you construct a poem? When do you know it's done? You know, that kind of ambiance that you find yourself in order to create.
That's a good question. The question was, it's complicated, sort of what is the space you enter in some sense to create a poem, and when do you know it's done? My poems have changed over the years because my time constraints have changed, and also where I write. I've never had a particular place that I go. I've had friends who say, I always write in this room, I always have a glass of scotch. I mean, friends who have a variety of rituals. I don't have any particular ritual. Part of it is right now because I think I have a job and children, and I'm really, blessed with a full life. And so, my ritual is to go, where I can when I have 12 minutes, and if that means just sort of sitting down in the corner somewhere, then I'll do that. And I have a fourth collection of poetry that's sort of circling around out in the publishing world called Deuce, and the poems are very short. They're very short. And I'm sort of not surprised because I really, at the point where I was dominantly working on this collection, I just didn't have time to kind of throw the long pass, I mean, I think they're very pithy, and they took me, a million years to write just because I thought if they're going to be this short, there's so much white space. It's like the white space is just sort of shouting at the words to matter, So, I mean, there's nothing. But that said, they didn't necessarily, each poem didn't necessarily take a ton of time, where I had to keep returning to that poem to sort of stretch and stretch and stretch and find where the gaps were and find where I needed to expand. So, to some degree, even the length of the poem can be dictated by just how much time I have. I often return, I have poems always have poems in several stages of development. So if I have a half an hour, I can go to my computer and I can look at a poem that I know needs a certain kind of editing. I know something's not working. I know the poem has basically the completed arc of the poem. I've spent some time with it, but it needs something. It needs some juice. Something's not going on. And I can work on that for a half an hour. It's much harder to sort of take a group of notes that I've been gathering in that half hour and say, now I'm going to begin a poem, because I know that'll take more time. So really the kind of poem that I work in, and I have poems in all sorts of different states. Some poems they need just tweaking. They need just sort of an elbow, a little edge up, or maybe I'm going to just play with the form. Maybe I'm going to turn something in quatrain into tercets and just see how that goes. So really how much time I have dictates kind of what kind of poem I go to, because I have them in all different stages. I'm not a person that works at one poem at a time. I was really raised, I'm really raised in a very middle-class fashion. I'm very practical. I don't wait for the muse. I don't need rituals. I don't have spaces. And that's what I teach. I teach, it's rigor. And it's not that there's not talent involved, but it's really about rigor and getting out of your own way. I told this to my daughter the other day, who was practicing piano, and I said, you've got to learn to get out of your own way in life. And I think that's actually my strongest suit, and as mushy or new age as that sounds, which is not my thing at all. But I think I'm good at getting out of my own way. I don't allow myself excuses. And that's sort of a strange answer for this question, which is to say there is no particular space or even a particular mindset I have to go in. If I have the time, it's what I always want to do. I always want to be doing that. I just can't. I just can't, But that's all right, too, because, I love teaching, and, my life with my kids is, interesting and strange. It provides lots of material in strange, ways and surprising ways. So I guess that would be, as far as when I know a poem's done, it's done when I stop sort of complaining about it to myself. When it stops whining, and when I stop whining, then I think it's done, When I can read through it and still enjoy it and not read through some parts faster because I know they're not quite as interesting, When I can jump in at any point and read that stanza aloud and think, you're holding up, then I feel as though it's done. But that's such a contingent state, because 6 months later I may go back and say, oh, you're not quite done. You thought you were over, but you're not. So, and even when I put them in a manuscript form, it probably takes a couple years from then on, even then. So, but I'm not one of those people who goes back to my old poems and says, oh, I've got to change that. I look at them as sort of representative of what I could do then, And I think I did a good job of what, with what the materials I had then. I look at some of the poems in my first book, Diasporatic. I don't know how to write those poems anymore. I know how to write new poems, but I was writing these persona poems at the time. I was working with Richard Howard, the guy who wrote Our Spring Trip, who's so good at entering other people's voices. And I was working hard with him. I really wanted desperately to please him, and I wrote these poems, and I'm very proud of them. I don't know how to write them anymore, but I know how to do something else, so that's okay. So. Thank you.
Carl, you get the last question.
Make it a good one.
I'm wondering if you feel like your work or maybe the perspectives on your work might be constricted by titling a book hilarity. That people can only then view it through that lens. They say, oh, this is a funny book. It's
Right.
about being funny. And is that do you feel that's constricting?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I'll tell you that I was really, really fortunate to have my book reviewed. I mean, in a little way, but in the New York Times Book Review. And that was quite thrilling for me, And and whereas the review was positive, which was lovely, I'm going to put this diplomatically, I had no evidence that the reviewer actually spent time with the book as the result of reading the review. Because he talked about how this book is in some way, kind of what you're talking about, about humor. And it's really, as I said to Dr. Leahy's class this morning, the book's not very funny. I mean, really, the whole book, it's not like a yuck fest. It truly is not. I mean, it's kind of surreal. It's kind of strange. It's kind of poignant in certain parts. I mean, I think it hits a pretty wide emotional spectrum, which is sort of my emotional spectrum. I'm fortunate enough to feel that myself. But so I felt in relation to that review, I did feel like, don't lock me in, to this. I mean, I was happy it was positive, but beyond that, I felt a little grumpy because I did feel as though he'd sort of taken that title and applied it in the most literal fashion. Where I derived the title was from a book on child rearing where a writer, a nonfiction writer, called the moment where the child first laughs, which happens in about 6 weeks. And they referred to that as the emergence of hilarity. And of course, they're not talking about comedy, they're talking about when the child first discovers laughter. I mean, this physical reaction, and which was, as we all know, is a reaction to so many things. It's a reaction to joy. It's also a reaction to nervousness. Sometimes it's a reaction to pain, So hilarity is really, I think it's much bigger than that, but it is a certain kind of reaction. And generally speaking, a humorous lens is my lens, is the way that I see the world, kind of for better and worse. So, but I will say, generally speaking, I don't feel like I can worry about that. Much as I said I care about the audience, and I do, I can't, I send it out into the world. It's the right title. It means what I want it to mean. If somebody's going to look at that through a more limited lens that I would like, that's their prerogative. I'm not always the best reader either, I've been a good reader for some people in my life. I look back at some of the workshops I was in when I was in graduate school and think, oh God, I hope I'm forgiven for some of the idiotic things I said, but I did the best I could at that moment, and now I truly look back in some poems and think, that was a good poem. And I spent 20 minutes taking it down, so I mean, it's interesting. I can't worry too much about it, I guess I would say. And if I did, that would be self-editing, and I can't really do that. I write what I need to write, and I think hilarity says what I need it to say in the best way I could. So then it's up to you, But thank you. It's an interesting question.
All right. Thank you very much for attending. If you don't have Patty Seyburn's book, they're for sale out in the hallway from Barnes & Noble, and I think they have 2 of the collections, Hilarity and one other collection, Mechanical Cluster. As you can tell from the title, it's hysterical. And also the books from all the other poets in the series, and I think copies of the literary journal Dirt Cakes, and we have the editor here, Catherine Keefe, so check that out too. We'll see you, hopefully some of you, at 5 o'clock for the reading. Thanks.